Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning or good evening if you are joining from other time zones. Thank you for being here with us, and welcome to another edition of the webinar series hosted by EU DisinfoLab. As you might know, EU DisinfoLab is a non-profit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe. My name is Raquel Miguel. I'm part of the research team, and I'm very honored to moderate a session that is more opportune than ever, and probably one of the most awaited ones. Beyond deepfakes, AI-related risks for elections with Sophie Murphy Byrne. Sophie, welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation. But before introducing our guest speaker properly, let me mention a few housekeeping rules that may already sound familiar to those that regularly follow us. First, this session is being recorded, and the playback will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. Second, for communication purposes and for the Q&A session, we will be using Slido, an app which you can open on your phone by scanning the QR code you are currently seeing on the screen, or by typing in your web browser slido.com, and when requested, adding the hashtag disinfo. Please don't use the chat on Zoom. Let's get some audience interaction by inviting you to answer 2 questions. Please let us know where you are joining us from today and which sector you represent. Quick reminder for the latecomers, slido.com, hashtag disinfo. I'll give you a minute. And in the meantime, let me please remind that you are in one of the webinars that EU DisinfoLab is regularly hosting. If you are part of the counter disinformation community, this is the right place to be. And at the very least, you will hear the voices of the best experts in the field, such as Sophie, and you will stay up to date on research, policy, and responses to disinformation. And this webinar today is as well our way to contribute to the Democratic Shield initiative, across society action to improve societal resilience to disinformation attacks and safeguard the security and integrity of the European Parliament elections this year. Okay, let's have a look at the replies now. Wow, a lot of people from the north of Europe, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Scotland, Germany. We have mainly cities and countries in Europe, but also from the other side of the Atlantic, Canada. That's great. And let's have a look now at the sectors represented. Mostly are joining from non-government organizations, but also from academia, media, and business and other sectors. That's really great, because today we will be talking about one topic that is of special interest to all these sectors and citizens in general. We will combine 2 topics that go hand in hand with each other this year: artificial intelligence and elections. With 1 week to go before the European elections, we will address the risks that artificial intelligence technologies pose in terms of electoral disinformation, looking at recent electoral events from which we can draw the first lessons. But we will try to go beyond the most evident cases of content creation and manipulation, and talk about the use of artificial intelligence to exacerbate existing risks, to distribute content, or to profile voters more accurately. And we will talk about potential solutions and responses as well. Without further delay, I am pleased to introduce Sophie Murphy Byrne. She is responsible for EU government affairs at Logically, a scale-up operating globally with a mission to tackle the harms associated with mis- and disinformation online. Prior to Logically, Sophie spent 4 years working in EU affairs in Brussels, including in the permanent representation of Ireland to the European Union. Her primary focus is tech policy, specifically as regards the regulation of artificial intelligence and digital service providers. Sophie, looking forward to listening to your presentation and engaging in a Q&A session. From this moment on, our audience can submit questions on Slido, and as usual, we will come back to them after the presentation. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Super. Thank you so much, Raquel, for that very kind introduction. And just while I share my screen, I'll also take the opportunity to thank EU DisinfoLab for the invitation to speak today on such a salient topic at quite a critical moment. Raquel, do you mind confirming that my slides are seen well?
Perfectly, Sophie.
Super. So Raquel briefly introduced us, but just to go into a little bit more detail for those who might not be familiar with Logically, we are indeed a private company operating globally from offices in the US, the UK, and India. And we do three things in the counter disinformation space. We are a fact-checking organization. We also conduct open source intelligence investigations, more commonly referred to as OSINT. And we're also an AI company. So we're developing and deploying our own proprietary AI models to support those operations I've just mentioned in terms of OSINT and fact-checking. I will just take a moment to go into a little bit of detail about our fact-checking arm. We are one of the largest commercial fact-checking teams in the world. We're accredited by the International Fact-Checking Network. We're a member very recently of the European Digital Media Observatory, and will eventually be subject to standards or codes of practice and principles that derive from the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, as well as expected Indian self-regulatory standards. So the reason I want to spend a moment on the fact-checking side of the company is for a fact-checking organization to be accredited to the International Fact-Checking Network, we have to demonstrably abide by rigorous and robust editorial policies, including as regards our independence and our transparency. So this led to the creation in 2023 of Logically Facts. This was to ensure that editorial independence of our fact-checking arm. So Logically Facts is a completely separate business unit to the parent brand of Logically, which is serving government and private sector organizations. So it's just very crucial to make that distinction. Logically is working on the government and private sector organization side, and then Logically Facts is the fact-checking arm, and that is primarily our platform-facing side of the business. So we currently work with Meta and TikTok in both the UK and Europe. And a lot of that, which is relevant to our discussion today, has resulted in, particularly with TikTok, a lot of media literacy work in the context of elections, particularly in the UK. So with that lovely segue, this audience is likely already more than aware of the risks that emerging AI technologies can present for elections, and that there are so many globally significant elections this year only spotlights this further. It is quite incredible to think that half of the world's population is estimated to go to the polls in 2024, as well as the fact that this is coinciding with the advent of generative AI tools becoming commonly available as never before. So of course, concerns from actors like ourselves is that these tools will lead to a maturation of attempts to fully automate disinformation campaigns. But one of the reasons that we were so eager to participate in this event was because of its distinct focus on disinformation that goes beyond just deepfakes. Most of the electoral interference that we've been observing thus far is a lot more complicated than that. This, of course, doesn't mean that we disregard incidents like the infamous audio that circulated right before the Slovakian elections late last year, or the deepfake video allegedly showing a candidate withdrawing from the race in Bangladesh earlier this year. We just don't want to lose sight of the fact that disinformation is not a new problem, and that from our perspective, it's about a lot more than just content. It's really a dissemination problem. The likes of labeling and watermarking efforts are certainly welcome, but overall insufficient if they are looked at as the only responses to this problem. Logically, would perceive that the majority of harm derives from the virality of content. So our view is that the earlier that these campaigns are disrupted, the better. So just to set the scene about our focus today, we will be looking more into the behaviors. So to take an example from late last year, in the Argentinian election in October 2023, we identified campaigns that sought to reduce voter turnout. So we would have seen a lot of narrative circulating on X, formerly Twitter, which pushed conspiracies related to Agenda 2030. We didn't see deepfakes during this election. This is the more traditional disinformation campaign that we would have come across. So for example, we identified a campaign called #YoNoVoto, or in English, I'm not voting, which claimed that the election process was fraudulent and urged voters to stay home and abstain from the vote as an act of rebellion against that. So these are the more traditional approaches to election interference. This is the exploitation of the information space with falsehoods. But these are, of course, the sorts of campaigns that technologies like generative AI can exacerbate. To take not even just a recent election, a very much ongoing election, this audience will likely be aware that the biggest election in this so-called super election year also happens to be the biggest election that the world has ever seen, with almost 1 billion people eligible to vote in these elections that are soon to conclude next week in India. Now, from what we've seen looking at this election, mis and disinformation is rampant. We've seen old speeches being shared out of context. We've seen videos being clipped to change the original meaning of what was said, old footage being circulated to support allegations of tampering with electronic voting machines, allegations of booth capturing, what have you. All of this alongside news items being altered to allegedly show more dubious results of opinion polls. But in addition to this, what we have seen is an abundance of edited or manipulated old videos being misrepresented and then shared during this election campaign so as to push certain narratives. So this is where the risks of technology come in, because that's what's being used to create false content. For example, audio clones of Bollywood actors allegedly supporting opposition parties. And while there have been a few instances of deepfake videos or AI-generated audio clones, the issue in these elections that we've seen is that the word deepfakes has been used far too loosely, and we've seen content being misreported as such. So I'd just like to stop here for a moment on terminology, because we really can't conflate deepfakes and AI-generated or manipulated content. When we're talking about a deepfake, we're talking about the capacity for face reenactment, so advanced software being used to manipulate the features of a real person's face, or face generation, where entirely new images of fake people are created using images of real faces, but the ultimate result not reflecting a real person, or even speech synthesis, where a model of a voice is created, as we've mentioned. This is different to cheap fakes. So this is primarily what we're seeing, this relabeling or editing of footage, or even just recontextualizing content. So taking out certain elements of it, whether that be a statement or a gesture or an action, and then presenting content in a completely different context. Now, we mentioned that the focus is going to be on behaviors here. And what we found in India is that the way that mis and disinformation is circulating in the information space does remain the same as what we might have seen here before. What's different from the last general elections in 2019 is the emergence of generative AI technology, and not just the use of deepfakes, but as we've mentioned, the misuse of that word deepfakes. The issue is that if you mislabel content as a deepfake, you're planting a seed of doubt in someone's mind. So we've seen instances where a real video of a politician is called a deepfake. This then lends them plausible deniability by planting that seed of doubt. So the issue is not just lending legitimacy to fake content, but also taking away legitimacy from real content. And this is where media literacy really is of the essence, because some people do believe this content. Like we might sit here on this webinar and think, well, there's no way I would believe that, but this is something that people demonstrably fall for. The content that we've been seeing spread in India is designed to appeal to emotions, and it usually is translated into regional languages so as to ensure a greater stronghold. And this is happening across all platforms. It's not just WhatsApp, which of course is a very key platform in India, but we also see this on X, on Facebook, Instagram. We even see this not just gravitating from one platform to another, but from political speeches into posts online. Now, I've alluded a lot to where new AI technologies change the landscape of the disinformation threats. So the oldest trick in the books that we have discussed, whether that be the planting of falsehoods, use of cheap fakes, the editing of content for misrepresentation purposes, these all see a step change with the emergence of generative AI. The concern is that generative AI can make these kinds of campaigns cheaper to design, easier to deploy, more scalable, and ultimately supported by hyper-realistic and hyper-targeted content. And as those new tools become available for public consumption, the generation of false and misleading text, videos, images, audio, these all become all the more straightforward and inexpensive, with outcomes that can often defy immediate detection efforts. The issue is that the sophistication and quality of this content is significantly advancing, and that's the emerging capability which poses the fresh risk. And we see that risk manifesting in a number of ways, the first of which would be a lower barrier to entry. So this audience will probably remember that in the US presidential election in 2016, the Russian Internet Research Agency ran an operation which cost about $12 million and required about 14 people. And in many ways, it operated as a digital startup. It had performance metrics, issued employee assessments, it measured audience engagement, what have you. But with these new AI technologies, the execution of such a campaign no longer depends on having that kind of large, skilled, well-organized team. Those kinds of end-to-end campaigns can now be created for as little as $400 and by an average private citizen in their bedroom using open source technology. I'm not sure if this audience might be aware, but we've come across a proof of concept AI system called CounterCloud, which effectively identifies specific articles according to its operator's brief, and then automatically prompts a large language model to generate content based on the same themes, but from different perspectives. And that AI system is capable of generating fake comments, images, sound clips, all to go with the article. And it can even generate social media posts that counter opposing content by trolling. This is what we mean when we talk about an example of this kind of campaign having the potential to be delivered for less than $400. The second way that we would see this emerging is through the risk of what's called flooding the zone. This is a recognized tactic of Chinese state disinformation. And effectively what we mean is the use of generative AI to increase the volume of content such that an overarching sense of mistrust is fostered in society overall. And crucially, even though a lot of people would think, okay, well, I know that, you look for however many fingers or what have you, all the tactics that we should know, to kind of test our digital literacy in that way. Even if the output is initially of lower quality, that overload of untailored content is exactly what contributes to that overarching sense of mistrust. One example from roughly a year ago, audience members might remember the image that allegedly showed the Pentagon suffering from an explosion last year. This was a claim that was debunked in under 20 minutes, but it still managed, that was all it took for the stock market to be impacted and for local law enforcement to be mobilized. So there are very much real world impacts from this. And while in the short term, human oversight will obviously still be needed, the workload of a disinformation actor has been drastically reduced. And in the long term, there is a risk that we could see disinformation factories which are fully powered by large language models. A third risk that we would see is in terms of micro-targeting. Obviously there's an ongoing debate about whether mis and disinformation can effectively influence behavior, but AI can significantly enhance profiling by scraping online digital footprints and use behavioral data to predict and generate content that's likely to appeal to a user. So I'm not sure if anyone else was aware, but we were very shocked to find out that a user's gender can be predicted with 93% accuracy just from looking at their likes. So this is all without analyzing any actual posts. And we see similar high accuracy rates when it comes to using likes-based predictions on a user's politics or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation. What we're talking about here is the risk of essentially personalized disinformation, coupled with the capacity of stance detection algorithms that can identify post sentiment. And this leads me to the final risk I'll talk about here, which is the capacity of large language models to be used as part of fully automated and individualized conversations. There is a real risk of that kind of malicious appropriation of the technology. This can be seen where chatbots could be deployed to engage in multi-turn conversations via comments on posts. Natural language generation systems could be used to write text which is compelling to us, and machine learning powered sentiment analysis can be used to assess messages and react in real time to optimize the deployment of certain messages. And the last one I'll mention is also that there are systems out there that have the potential to analyze emotional reactions, so your eye movements, your pupil dilation, or your facial expressions overall, to infer your feelings and adapt their approach in real time based on your approach, based on your response. So we've been looking into this extensively. In 2023, we tested publicly available generative AI tools, predominantly the image-based ones, to see how easy it would be to generate images that support common election disinformation narratives. What we found was that 85% of our prompts were accepted, generating images with hardly any content moderation controls. Now, that was something that we conducted in July 2023. So we've repeated the exercise quite recently in March of 2024, just on one of the platforms that we'd looked at. And when we looked at that one tool, it was quite clear that this issue has gotten worse and that you're now closer to a 90% acceptance rate of those kinds of prompts. We also tested to see if ChatGPT would repeat the content of social media posts containing disinformation. So we submitted prompts to it to rewrite social media posts that had the same sentiment and ideological stance, but that were written from different perspectives. So for example, the claim that dead people can vote in mail ballots, but hey, can you write it in the style that Donald Trump might say it? And our preliminary results were quite interesting because it was shown to us that the web version of ChatGPT does indeed qualify or refuse to respond to prompts that it deems unethical, but that its API version refusals are much less consistent. The API version is more likely to follow instructions precisely, particularly when asked to give output in specific programming code rather than text. And I'd just like to hang on that for a second. It's really important to consider that because those programming codes are how automated bots communicate with each other. This is how they can be instructed to customize content. So in that way, this is how ChatGPT could be used as a tool to rapidly activate and instruct bot accounts that can be used in the context of a disinformation account on social media. So keeping in theme with this webinar's discussion topic, obviously a key impact here is the elections. We've talked about how about 49% of the global population is voting this year. We all know the European Parliament elections are already taking place next week. We do recognize the ongoing debate regarding the impact of disinformation on elections and voting behavior. But what both sides of that debate do agree on is that it is possible to influence voters if you can effectively identify the most persuadable among them and then target and tailor your messages accordingly. Even the research which would argue that disinformation campaigns have limited effectiveness still acknowledge that risk. And that's where AI changes the landscape for these kind of malicious campaigns and presents a potentially dangerous tool for mass persuasion. Just again, thinking back to what we just detailed in terms of the capacity for micro-targeting using digital footprint and sentiment assessment in real time. But what's interesting is that the aim of disinformation campaigns is often not to disrupt elections. It tends to be ongoing activity designed to appeal to conspiracy mindsets and erode societal trust. So even in 2016 in the US, Russia aimed to amplify societal tensions, not necessarily to influence voting patterns. And this is evidenced by the fact that those accounts simultaneously supported both left-leaning and right-leaning positions. But this still can shift political beliefs and behaviors, and it still can increase xenophobic or discriminatory sentiment. We've seen short-term shifts in social media activity by prominent actors, for example, the AfD party in Germany, having the capacity for modest but still statistically detectable impacts on real-world violence. And Russian bot accounts use especially polarizing language to achieve this. In 2023, we tracked 15 different conspiracy narratives in the UK that had been seeded by Russian sources, which we observed proceeding to gain traction in fringe online groups. So this is where we see generative AI worsening the scope for such campaigns to have real-world impact. Many of the images and videos might initially not be of high quality, and everyone's reaction is, oh, but that wouldn't work on me. But you cannot focus on content alone. You have to look at how these campaigns operate, because the danger is in the cumulative effect of content appearing endlessly in different fora on different platforms. That's where the threat lies, in this sustained assault on evidence-based reasoning and overall trust in the information space. Now, we've briefly gone into a bit of labeling earlier, and I do want to reiterate that we welcome it. And I want to just clarify that I'm not saying that we don't need it. It's just that to look at it as the sole answer to this problem is wrong. So we've seen a forthcoming study which looked at the effectiveness of warning people that the video that they were about to watch is a deep fake, and still saw demonstrable influence of that deep fake video on those participants in that study, even though they knew about it. So to go into a bit of detail about what this study was, a bespoke deepfake video was created allegedly of a local government official appearing to accept a bribe. The participants were shown this and then asked questions about the official's guilt to test the influence of that content. And in assessing the person's guilt, 69% of the participants relied on the content that they had just watched, even though they'd been explicitly warned that it was fake beforehand. So in other words, they knew it to be fake and still used it as a reference point. Labeling doesn't stop people from referencing the claims that are made in certain content. Labeling systems of the kind that have been announced by a number of social media platforms and AI companies lately are really welcome and helpful, but they cannot be seen as entirely negating the influence of content like deepfake videos. Labeling won't deal with the potential societal harms that the circulation of that content can cause. And I would just like to say that we've spent many years working on these issues. We recognize that there is no deepfake detector in the sky. We've reached about a 70% accuracy rate when it comes to AI-generated image detection, which is about the market rate. But this is exactly the issue. It isn't at 100% anyway. And furthermore, there are no technological solutions to detect whether a single piece of text has been AI generated or not. You need a much larger data set to even begin to achieve such detection. I think it was OpenAI who recently shut their task force working on this because they only reached a 26% accuracy rate. So viewing verification as the silver bullet will lock us into a never-ending loop of work. It isn't something that can be seen as the sole answer here. Now, the good news is that all is not lost. Our experience has shown that while labeling and watermarking isn't sufficient alone, among a portfolio of approaches, it can really help. So let's recap so far on what we've spoken about. What problem are we trying to solve here? We are fundamentally vulnerable to disinformation. The immediate reaction is, I would never be persuaded by that. How could I be? But we need to be encouraged to test our media literacy skills, because the academic literature is clear that mis and disinformation can influence society and that it is possible to influence voting patterns. So to go back again to that much studied example of the 2016 US election, research that we've seen has shown that an increase of 25K in the weekly retweets of accounts that were affiliated to the Russian state correlated to a 1% increase in Trump's polling numbers at the time. Now, of course, correlation is not causation, and debate about that impact is ongoing. But as we've already talked about, both sides of this debate do agree that people can be influenced if you can identify the most persuadable among them. We've also learned that disinformation is not always to promote a specific narrative. It's there primarily to worsen tensions by acting as this onslaught of an attack online. I repeat, this is a dissemination and content problem. Harm derives from the virality, and so the earlier that campaigns are disrupted, the better. So that's what Logically is trying to solve. We're trying to solve the circulation and vulnerability issue by developing technology to try and limit the time that content remains online. And we want to help platforms identify and triage this content before too many people see it. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about the ways in which we're using AI as a safety tool, because we see room for the technology to be used to detect the tactics that are most used in these kind of interference efforts. So we've developed models which can identify the behaviors that are associated with what's called coordinated inauthentic behavior, CIB, at scale. And by looking at those predefined behaviors, we can identify accounts with common patterns of that suspicious coordination of messages. So if you look on the left-hand side here, you'll see a few of those mentioned, whether that be co-reposting, co-hashtags, co-mentions, co-sharing of the same images or the same URLs, what have you. This is how we used AI to determine that the disinformation campaigns during Argentina's election that we talked about earlier were not circulating organically. But I would just like to also point you to that sentence down at the bottom of this slide. AI can only go so far here. And these kinds of interactions listed on the left on social media are not always harmful. Sometimes they're used in fandom communities. And this is where the human in the loop capacity is so necessary. So, for example, I don't know how many Taylor Swift fans we might have on the call today. I'm a massive fan. I can't wait to go and see the Eras tour in a couple of weeks. Looking forward to it for months. Those are the same behaviors that I might be using with my friends or with people I know online within that fandom community. And so this is what we're talking about when it comes to the capacity and limitations of AI. AI models certainly are capable of identifying trends and patterns, but they cannot definitively confirm if such behavior amounts to disinformation or into a specific campaign. Our OSINT teams are the ones that are providing that very feedback loop in terms of being a human in the loop to distinguish the disinformation actors, because that's the contextualization that AI is simply not able to apply to what it's pulling up as these dubious patterns that it finds. So it's our OSINT teams in our use of AI who will be reviewing, judging whether that content definitively signals foreign interference activity via disinformation based on that contextual knowledge. And also the use of human review also does ensure that we can keep up to date, because obviously the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by disinformation actors are ever evolving and constantly emerging. And this is really where Logically sees that we can add value. It's via this focus on the behaviors. So I'll give a little bit of detail about what we're developing. Cast your mind back to the beginning. We talked about fact-checking operations way back at the beginning. We are working on deploying AI to supercharge the efforts of fact-checkers to conduct the debunking of these kinds of campaigns online. What we're developing is a multilingual and multimodal tool, which can analyze up to millions of pieces of content and effectively filter out what claims are most worthy of a fact-checker's time. So initially, we're focused on short form video. Think of your YouTube shorts, your TikToks. But the intention is that this will also support images and text and audio. And really what we're trying to achieve here is reducing the amount of time that fact checkers have to spend deciding what claims they should spend the time verifying. I'll just give a little bit of technical detail behind it, because I'm hoping that I can do it in an explain like I'm five understandable version. We're talking about the process of accelerating claim extraction. So the tool that we're developing is intended to process videos into a block of text, proceed to break that text down into statements, and then use AI to score those statements to look for claims which are fact-check worthy. And we're talking about fact-check worthiness assessed by, in the same way that any fact-checking organization will be required to follow in their methodology, what can be empirically verified as true or false, and what is the difference between a claim versus an opinion. There's something very different between Joe Biden is supporting the production of biolabs in Ukraine versus I really like chocolate ice cream. So we're hoping that this tool, among others that we're developing, can ensure that debunking can keep pace with the growing volume and scale of content that we've talked about in this webinar today. There is a bit more in our product pipeline, but we're going to be announcing that more on that in the near future, so I won't go into it today. I think to conclude, before we go to Q&A, I'd just like to draw attention to the threats that companies like us will face in this space. We are a client-facing company, but about 30% of our work is done in the public interest and is made publicly available on our website because we feel that we have a moral obligation to do so. Our OSINT practitioners may face threats online due to their work, and legal action may be threatened, but above all, the issues that threaten our operations more so than anything else is issues with access to platform data. This audience is probably already more than aware that increasingly restrictive data access policies among social media platforms really destructively hamper efforts to study and counteract societal harms like AI-generated disinformation. And while initiatives like the EU Digital Services Act explicitly strengthen access for researchers studying disinformation, that provision stops short of facilitating this for commercial entities like us who are also conducting that very important public interest work. So that's a final thought I'll leave you with before we go to Q&A. It's our call for improved multi-stakeholder access that truly enables cross-sectoral independent research and ultimately contributes to facilitating the whole of society approach, which is badly needed when it comes to tackling this threat to our societies and democratic processes. I'd like to say thank you for listening. I hope you're not too bored of the sound of my own voice, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have. Over to you, Raquel.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for sharing with us these fantastic insights on risks, but also on solutions. And now it's time to start the Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the QR code to join Slido or type slido.com #disinfo. We have around 20 minutes, more or less, for questions. And in this moment, I have to announce that we are more than 100 people in the room. And I'm going to take full advantage of my role as moderator, and I will give the first question. You have already mentioned and suggested the limitations of labeling AI content for addressing the problem. By the way, the audience is asking if you could share the study about the effectiveness of labeling AI-generated content. So
I need to check
please.
that. I think it's still due to come out. It's not my study. I will check them. I will.
Okay. So I wanted to take the opportunity also to mention that EU DisinfoLab will publish 2 technical documents compiling and updating the policies that 5 big social media platforms have put in place to address mis and disinformation related to elections and related to AI manipulated or generated content. Stay tuned for that. And precisely one of our main findings of this analysis is that when addressing AI content, platforms are focusing more and more on labeling and less on moderation as a solution. For instance, Meta announced recently that from July on, it will not remove AI content from their platforms unless it violates other policies. In other words, it's more labeling and less removing AI content. But considering the limitations of labeling, do you think this is the right approach? What's your take on this? I know you already mentioned this, but I would like you to elaborate on this specific approach taken by platforms.
Totally. I think I would just like to preface my answer by saying that the choice of measures always remains with the platform, and that is something that not only do we never get involved in, but we don't even have the capacity to get involved in. Even the fact-checking arm, Logically Facts, that works directly with platforms, we don't have any oversight of how the ratings that we give to content is used by the platforms. We would love to know more, but we are very limited in where our working arrangements with them lie. And it does tend to be fairly one way. We don't usually, we might get limited anecdotal evidence about how our work is being used, but it's not something that we have oversight over. And we would very much believe that the right to choose what measures a platform takes remains with the platform. But to, just to kind of, I guess, reiterate on the labeling side of it, I really empathize when people say, oh, but the answer should be to label everything. Because I mean, as a fact-checking organization, of course, we would support the promotion of authoritative content over, simply moderating it, removing anything. Because what we're talking about is the capacity to educate people. Any counter-disinformation effort is welcome. Labeling and watermarking is so welcome. It's just that these are insufficient as sole responses. And I think what's crucial as well, and has been seen in certain initiatives coming out of the EU recently, for example, the election integrity guidelines for velopsies, which did talk about, the use of, for example, labeling by fact-checking organizations. We not only need to look at labeling efforts as one among many in a portfolio of counter-disinformation efforts, but also we need to meaningfully implement it in the first place. I would just reiterate that our view is that the harm from coordinated attacks does come from allowing the threats to spread unchecked, that it's not just a content issue where labeling can contribute, that it is also a dissemination issue where labeling isn't really going to help all that much. The earlier the campaigns are disrupted, the better. And that's where we see the use of AI coming in to facilitate that at speed and at scale.
Mm-hmm. There are 2 follow-up questions from the audience regarding platform policies and approaches. The first one, do platforms actually have the technology to tackle AI-generated content instead of relying exclusively on self-declaration? This is the first one.
I don't work for any of the platforms, so my answer will be limited by that. I mean, obviously, I'm following, the announcements of new policies regarding AI-generated content, many of which are specifically related to elections. What we do know of their capacity is that most platforms do have the ability to convert fact check labels into machine readable signals that can then facilitate any downranking decisions that they might make. You've already mentioned an announcement made by Meta earlier. We obviously looked at the announcement from YouTube that it will require creators to disclose the upload of manipulated or synthetic content. I guess while I don't have the knowledge to go into detail about whether they have the capacity to or not, what I would just say is that obviously we're concerned that many of the big tech companies have made significant cuts to their workforce, and that those cuts are primarily found in their trust and safety teams and in content moderation teams. Many platforms have moved to hinder research into disinformation on their services overall that we've mentioned, and that really would have been crucial to understanding the issue and implementing safeguards for election integrity. So I'm sorry that I can't go into any more detail about exactly what they have on hand. Maybe someone's online and can answer that.
It's perfectly fine, Sophie. Thank you for this. And the second question related to the platforms, it's about the recent Meta announcement that is allowing users to opt out until the 26th of June from it using content to train AI. Our member of the audience says that it seems the process is especially difficult on purpose, and if you have any thoughts on this.
At risk of repeating myself, I am limited and won't comment on exactly what efforts platforms make. So I hope you'll allow me to not present an answer to that one purely just because it's not information that I have on hand.
Of course. We have many different questions. Maybe the most voted one can go next. How well do these technologies you are testing and using work in languages other than English?
Mm-hmm. Hugely important, and it's really our technical experts who'll be able to give a better answer than me on this. Primarily right now, where majority of our work has gone to demonstrate the proof of concept from the beginning, because this is very much something that is very much still under development. We have mostly been using the English language to try and get as much of the accuracy rate up as possible. From there, it will be possible for this to be multilingual. We do have that capacity. This will be something that will cover all EU languages, for example, including, we would hope, regional languages. So obviously thinking of Spain in particular in terms of Galician, Catalan, what have you. So I'm not the data scientist who will be able to give you the exact F1 score on where we're at right now. I'm sure it's already changed in the last 2 days since I last spoke to him. But rest assured that we fully recognize the problem that is prevalent with there being too much of a focus on English language content, and we fully intend for anything that we develop to have multilingual capacity.
Mm-hmm. There is another one related to media literacy. I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more. You already mentioned this. Would you like to add something? What role can or should media literacy education play?
Mm-hmm. I think I can go further than that and actually give you an on-the-ground example, because obviously the UK elections haven't happened yet, but the UK had local elections last year, and we worked quite a lot with TikTok on that. And so one example of what we did, because we did the usual, the preparation of debunks, media literacy articles that were intended to help users improve their critical thinking skills, how to spot an AI-generated image, what have you. But we also worked with TikTok to create on-platform interventions. So specifically during the UK local elections, which was May 2023, we worked with TikTok to have a capacity that when a user would type in a keyword that was associated with the election, a pop-up would come up to that user that redirected them to the TikTok community guidelines, to the content that we had created on media literacy that I just mentioned, as well as the redirection to a specific media literacy hub that contained not just text, like articles on all of these media literacy skills, but also videos, because we are trying to make this as appealing as possible to as many people as possible. And I think this might, as well as kind of using that example of, the role that media literacy can play, I think I can tie it back into the language-related question a moment ago as well, because in terms of the role that we see media literacy education playing, we also worked with TikTok later in the year on Finland and Sweden specific media literacy videos, again, looking at improving those critical thinking skills. And those videos were, at last check, over 9 million views. Bear in mind that these were in the Swedish and Finnish languages. Like that amount of engagement is far higher than even the population of those countries. So we were really pleased to see that. And I think that demonstrates that media literacy education is essential in terms of, how we're going to see that playing out in outcomes or content online and people's capacity to differentiate from fact and falsity during the elections this year. I suppose that remains to be seen. But I think just to comment on that traction that we saw that content gaining, it was quite remarkable for us to see that. And I think that it demonstrates that people are paying attention and really want to be able to ascertain what they're seeing in the information space.
Thank you, Sophie. There are quite a lot of members of the audience asking for a comment on the recent All Eyes on Rafah campaign, AI generated, as we know, that was shared more than 50 million times in a few hours. What can be learned from it?
I wish I had my OSINT analyst with me who would have looked at it properly. I mean, I suppose we can still at a high level talk about what can be learned from AI generated campaigns generally. It does tie in with what we just talked about, you need media literacy from the ground up. You need to be able to empower any user to be able to make the distinction of what is AI generated and what is not, to the best that this is possible. Any other counter mis or counter disinformation efforts are not useless, but their effect does become less meaningful if you don't have that background of media literacy capacity among the users who are seeing it. I would also point to initiatives that the EU has come out with recently for, again, in the election integrity guidelines for velocities that under the DSA that came out a couple of months ago. I think when you talk about these kind of campaigns being shared at such a degree of virality in just a few hours, I mean, this is exactly the kind of behavior that we're raising the alarm bell about. And I think this is what those guidelines would try to respond to, because one specific recommendation made in those guidelines was for velocities to put in place a so-called incident response mechanism during an electoral period. And the purpose of this would be that if you have a campaign like this being shared to such a degree of virality in such a short space of time, or you have something like we saw in the Slovakian elections where that audio was dropped into the information space with limited time to go until the vote took place, those teams within platforms would be the ones dedicated to have that earlier intervention that we have already been talking about earlier in this webinar. This is exactly what we think the problem is. It's this capacity for virality, and we think that the processes need to be in place to disrupt that. The earlier, the better.
And talking about virality, we have a couple of more technical questions regarding coordinated inauthentic behavior. One reads, have you seen AI tactics to enhance CIB recently, or how can AI technologies enhance CIB? And there are a couple of more questions in the same direction. Yeah, it's difficult to follow such a long chat, but could you elaborate on the problem of the coordinated inauthentic behavior and how AI can push this?
Totally. I think it's kind of what we already went into detail about earlier, and I'll just repeat the 4 risk tactics, so to speak, again. One of which is the capacity for AI to lower the barriers to entry. You don't have to be affiliated to a nation state to be capable of carrying out these kinds of CIB campaigns. You can just be a private citizen in your bedroom using open source technology and using less than $400 to carry out a campaign like that. The second tactic we talked about was the capacity for flooding the zone. So this goes back to the generative AI models that we demonstrated our studies on, where you're able to flood the zone with a higher volume of, yes, untailored and lower quality content, that this is what contributes to an overarching sense of mistrust in society as a whole, and that only creates a more fertile ground for CIB campaigns to take hold. The third one that we talked about was micro-targeting, in terms of the capacity for users' digital footprints to be effectively scraped so that campaigns can be more personalized towards them. And the last of which was the capacity of, really tied into that, but about the capacity of large language models to be used for individualized and personalized conversations to the same end. So really chatbots being able to be misused in that way. Those would be the 4 risks that I think we went into a bit more detail about earlier.
Mm-hmm. There are also a couple of questions related to the formats. One of them refers to the text. We mostly talk about deepfakes in terms of images and videos, but what about AI-generated text? How should this risk be addressed? And another one refers to audio. Recent trends increasingly point to the use of deepfake audio. What new risks and challenges does this bring for elections?
Absolutely. So I'll just take the text one first, because I think it's something we detailed earlier already. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. We don't have the deepfake detector in the sky when it comes to AI generated text. Again, this is something that OpenAI themselves closed down a task force working on, because they could only get to a 26% accuracy rate. Our work on this started from looking at an effort that was called Grover, which I think you'll find online. I think it was from 2019, which basically assessed how many data points you would need to be able to remotely identify the patterns in text as in terms of indicating whether this was generated by an AI system or by a human. You need at minimum 5,000 pieces of content just to be able to really get any accuracy level there. This isn't something that there are technological efforts to detect right now, and it is a huge problem, especially when considering the results of the study that we demonstrated earlier in terms of where ChatGPT could be maliciously appropriated in this way. In terms of the audio side of it, again, it goes back, we've mentioned some examples of where this very much has presented risks and challenges in elections in recent months. I think it's something that we absolutely recognize is just another way that the information space can be flooded. It's another way that societal mistrust is fostered overall. And it's really a key reason in why the products that we're developing, like that acceleration of fact checking that we talked about earlier, is intended to be multimodal. We aren't there yet. We're still working on it. But the point is that we absolutely see the risks of this. In fact, I don't want to misquote any of my colleagues, but I do hear consistent discussion of just how many difficulties audio deepfakes do present to us, much more so than any of the other formats that we've discussed.
Before going on with the questions, there are plenty of them. I would like to take advantage as well of your experience in the policy field. The AI Act has been green-lighted recently. The time is tight and it will not be implemented before these European elections. But I'm going to ask you to imagine that it's already in force. It has already been established. And to imagine what things could change regarding the AI-related risks if we would have the AI Act in place already.
Okay. Let's first distinguish that the AI Act regulates the use cases of AI technology across the 27 EU member states and not content. So the EU's counter-disinformation framework in that regard is separate. But of course, the DSA is linked to the AI Act. So the ways in which, if we had it in force right now, that I would see this playing out is you would look to Article 35 in the DSA, which cites the application of labels on deepfakes and other AI-generated content as a possible mitigation measure that platforms can take. So in election context, because this is also mentioned in those election integrity guidelines that I've mentioned a few times, I would hope that those kind of labels, among other efforts like the means of tackling dissemination that we've talked about, I would still hope that those labels are being applied in the way that they're being prescribed. Furthermore, the AI Act does require that anyone publishing a deepfake does disclose that the content has been AI generated or manipulated, and requires developers to ensure that any AI generated media is detectable. So again, this is all contributing to the overall effective implementation of the DSA. And what's also worth remembering is that should a VLOPSI, a very large online platform research engine, embed a general purpose AI system into their platform, that AI model then effectively becomes subject to the DSA risk framework. And this is because the DSA obliges VLOPSIs to assess potential systemic risks coming from the design, functioning, and use of their services, including how their algorithmic systems may contribute to such risks. But really, where the AI Act could probably make most of a difference is in its proactive approach to transparency among those providers of general purpose AI models, so like your ChatGPTs of the world. The question is whether transparency alone is enough to affect meaningful change. So what we will see as a result of the AI Act is that humans must be notified if they're interacting with a chatbot or another AI system, and that should hopefully serve to empower users to be more critical of a system's output. And then, of course, you've got different rules, again, for the for general purpose AI models that are considered to present systemic risks. So, for example, the potential to cause large scale harm from the dissemination of false content, which is very relevant to what we're talking about now. In that scenario, the provider would have to conduct adversarial testing, do risk assessments and mitigate any risks identified, and also keep in contact with the European AI office that will be set up. There's a huge amount that the AI Act is going to try and do. From our perspective, the question now becomes, will the European AI office be sufficiently resourced to carry out its obligations? And crucially, will future codes of practice be capable of building on existing initiatives like the Code of Practice on Disinformation, so as to ensure that these issues are tackled in the round?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sophie. We are running out of time, but maybe we have time for the very last question. So we will take the most voted one in the chat. What else goes into assessing whether something is fact-check worthy? What about the gray area of claims which can't be empirically proven true or false?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you want to read more about it, if you go onto the Logically Facts website, you'll see this written in our FAQ when it comes to the methodology of how we go about selecting claims to fact check in the first place. When we're talking about the term fact check worthiness, we're talking about the likelihood that the content that you're looking at contains a claim that can be tested and ultimately verified or disproven. So this would include claims which use statistics or numerical data, claims that refer to scientific or academic, other expert-related information or concepts which can be checked against reliable sources. It would also include quotes of other speakers which themselves contain a factual assertion, again, something that can be empirically verified or debunked. It is really important that we clarify that a fact-check worthiness score does not indicate truthfulness. It indicates checkability. And fact checkers, who we would envision to be the end users of the product that we're developing, would still need to combine that fact check worthiness score with information such as the reach of the content and its potential for harm and the amount of other similar claims that might have been made. So we're never talking about a one-size-fits-all solution here.
Mm-hmm. So many questions are still in the chat, but unfortunately we don't have any more time. Thanks again, Sophia. Thank you so much. I hope our audience has enjoyed and learned a lot, which is something we'd love to hear about. You will be kindly requested to fill in a rating survey after the webinar ends, where, by the way, you can also suggest future topics to be covered in our sessions down the line. We always welcome your ideas and suggestions. And also a very quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available very shortly on our YouTube channel, where you can also catch up with the previous ones. And before wrapping up, let me advance our next two webinars. Next week, we will invite Duncan Meisel to share his insights on the climate advertisement industry. And the week after, we will have Victoire Rio, who will talk about monetization. We hope to keep seeing you around. And of course, don't forget that the registration for the EU DisinfoLab annual conference to be held in Riga in October is open. And more important, the early bird offer ends tomorrow. Don't miss this opportunity to register and pay a lower fee. Thanks again, Sophia. Thank you so much. Maria, also our support behind the scenes. And thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. Have a lovely rest of the day and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.